The fog crept through the Appalachian forest like a living thing, weaving between ancient oaks and crawling along the forest floor in tendrils that seemed to reach for unwary travelers. As October drew to a close in 2002, these mountains took on a particular kind of beauty. The leaves turned to a tapestry of amber and crimson, their colors somehow more vibrant in the crisp autumn air. This was hunting season in Nantahala National Forest, North Carolina, and for Tom Richards, it was practically a sacred ritual. At 46, Tom had the weathered look of someone who spent much of his life working with his hands. His face bore the lines of a man who smiled often, his brown eyes crinkled at the corners beneath slightly graying hair. Standing at 5'10" with a solid 170-pound frame, he carried himself with the quiet confidence of someone comfortable in his own skin. As the lead mechanic at Franklin's busiest service station, he'd built a reputation for honesty that kept customers coming back for 20 years. On this particular Thursday morning, October 24th, 2002, Sarah Richards watched her husband of 23 years load his blue 1987 Ford pickup truck with practiced efficiency. His movements were methodical, following the same pattern he'd established over 15 years of autumn hunting trips. "Sleeping bag?" Sarah asked, checking items off a mental list. "Got it," Tom replied, securing it with a bungee cord in the truck bed. "Backpack with food?" 3 days' worth of canned goods, plus extra, he confirmed, patting the sturdy olive green pack. "And your thermos?" Tom held up the stainless steel container. "Full of your coffee, the only thing that makes those cold mornings bearable." Sarah nodded, her blonde hair catching the morning light. At 44, she still had the same warm smile that had caught Tom's attention when they were barely out of high school. She worked as a receptionist at the local dentist's office, where patients appreciated her calming presence almost as much as her organizational skills. "You know the drill," Tom said, embracing her. "I'll be back Sunday evening. Monday morning at the latest, if the hunting's good." Sarah returned his hug, holding on perhaps a moment longer than usual. Later, she would remember this embrace with painful clarity. "Just be careful out there," she said, pulling back to look him in the eyes. "The weather report mentions some rain might be coming in." Tom grinned. "Been hunting these mountains since before we were married, darling. A little rain never hurt nobody." What neither of them knew, what they couldn't have known, was that within 72 hours, Tom Richards would vanish from the face of the earth, leaving behind only questions that would haunt this small town for half a decade. Earlier that morning, Tom had stopped by Garland's Gas and Auto, where he'd worked as head mechanic for the past 18 years. The bell above the door jangled as he entered, the familiar smell of motor oil and coffee greeting him. Jake Peterson looked up from behind the counter, a newspaper spread out before him. At 52, Jake had owned the station for over 2 decades, his business thriving largely thanks to Tom's reputation as the most reliable mechanic in 3 counties. "There he is," Jake called out. "The mighty hunter returns to the wild." Tom chuckled, reaching for the coffee pot. "Just wanted to remind you I won't be in until Monday. Jimmy knows what needs doing on the Wilson transmission, and the Miller truck just needs an oil change." Jake waved dismissively. "We'll manage, always do. You catch anything this year, and I expect a venison steak." "Deal," Tom agreed, draining his coffee cup. "Should be good hunting weather. Clear skies, cooler temperatures." The morning sun was climbing higher, and he still needed to pick up ammunition before heading to the mountains. By noon, Tom had parked his truck in front of Outdoor World, the sporting goods store where generations of local hunters had equipped themselves for expeditions into the Appalachians. The bell chimed softly as he entered, and Mike Garrett looked up from behind the counter. "Tom Richards, right on schedule," Mike greeted him warmly. "Got your usual box of Remington 30-06 set aside." "Appreciate it, Mike," Tom replied, approaching the counter. "How's business?" "Busy as can be. Hunting season brings out everybody with a rifle and a license." Mike slid the box of ammunition across the counter. "You heading up to your usual spot?" "Same place as always. That clearing at the end of Forest Service Road 7. Know it like the back of my hand by now." As Tom paid for his purchase, the store's door opened again. The air in the room seemed to shift as Chris Davis stepped in. At 52, Davis was a tall, lean man with dark hair threaded with gray and deep-set eyes that rarely softened. He worked as a carpenter, skilled with his hands but known for his quick temper. The two men's eyes met, and the silence that followed felt charged with unspoken tension. Mike Garrett glanced between them, clearly sensing the discomfort. "Afternoon, Chris," Tom said evenly, his tone neutral but guarded. "Richards," Davis replied curtly, his gaze dropping to the box of ammunition on the counter. "Hunting season already?" "Started yesterday," Tom confirmed. "You heading out too?" Something unreadable flashed across Davis's face. "Maybe. Got some work to finish first." The exchange was brief but loaded with subtext that only the two men fully understood. Mike handed Tom his change, and Tom pocketed it without looking down. "Good luck out there," Mike offered as Tom turned to leave. "Thanks. I'll need it if I want to bring home something worth bragging about," Tom replied with forced lightness. As he passed Chris Davis, Tom felt the man's eyes following him. Outside, Tom paused for a moment before starting his truck, a slight furrow appearing between his brows. The encounter had left him unsettled, though he couldn't have articulated exactly why. What Tom couldn't have known was that this brief exchange would later become a critical moment in a mystery that would confound investigators for years. It was the last time anyone in town would see the two men together. By mid-afternoon, Tom Richards was driving along the winding roads that led deep into the Nantahala National Forest. He rolled down his window, inhaling the crisp autumn air that carried the earthy scent of fallen leaves and pine. The radio played softly, a Johnny Cash song about home that seemed fitting as the civilized world fell away mile by mile. Tom knew these roads intimately. 15 consecutive years of hunting trips had engraved every turn and landmark into his memory. As the truck climbed higher, the forest grew denser, the sunlight filtering through the canopy in dappled patterns that played across the dashboard. "Almost there," he murmured to himself as he turned onto Forest Service Road 7, little more than a dirt track that snaked through increasingly remote terrain. The road ended at a small clearing where several hunters typically left their vehicles. Today, however, Tom found the area deserted. He parked his blue Ford at the edge of the clearing, the familiar surroundings bringing a sense of peace he rarely found elsewhere. Tom methodically gathered his essentials. The Remington rifle he'd maintained meticulously for over a decade. Ammunition, a compass, his backpack with food supplies, a sleeping bag, and the thermos of coffee Sarah had prepared. Each item went into its designated place with the precision of long practice. As he locked his truck and pocketed the keys, Tom surveyed the forest around him. The afternoon sun was beginning its descent, casting long shadows through the trees. He had a few hours of daylight left, enough time to reach his favorite hunting spot and set up camp before darkness fell. What Tom didn't notice as he shouldered his pack and headed into the woods was the dark green truck that had followed him at a distance throughout his journey. It now idled half a mile back down the forest road, its engine falling silent as Tom disappeared among the trees. And he certainly couldn't have known that this familiar forest, a place that had always represented freedom and solitude, would soon become the center of a desperate search and a lingering mystery that would haunt his family and community for years to come. The Nantahala National Forest stretch across more than 500,000 acres of western North Carolina. Its name derived from the Cherokee word meaning land of the noonday sun. In some of the deepest valleys, surrounded by towering ridges, sunlight reached the ground only when the sun was directly overhead. The forest was a maze of hidden hollows, rugged peaks, and dense woodland that could swallow a person whole. Tom Richards moved through this terrain with the quiet confidence of a man returning home. His footsteps fell softly on the carpet of pine needles and leaves as he followed a game trail that only the most experienced local hunters knew existed. After about 40 minutes of steady hiking, he reached a small ridge overlooking a valley where deer often grazed in the early morning hours. This was Tom's preferred hunting spot, far enough from the designated camping areas to ensure solitude, yet close enough to his truck that hauling out a deer wouldn't be overly strenuous. He set down his pack and began establishing his camp with practiced efficiency. First came the small one-man tent, pitched beneath the protective branches of a massive hemlock. Next, he arranged his sleeping bag inside and set up a small fire ring using stones gathered from a nearby creek. Tom was careful to keep the fire pit small and manageable, not for cooking so much as for the companionship of firelight during the long, cold night ahead. As dusk approached, Tom sat on a fallen log, eating cold beans directly from the can while studying the contours of the land below. The valley was beautiful in the fading light, the autumn colors deepening to rich burgundies and golds. In the distance, a hawk circled lazily on thermal currents, searching for its evening meal. Perfect, Tom murmured to himself, setting aside the empty can and reaching for his thermos. The coffee was still warm, and he savored it as the first stars began to appear in the darkening sky. It was in this moment of quiet contemplation that Tom first had the sensation of being watched. It wasn't anything he could pinpoint, no sound out of place, no movement catching his peripheral vision, just a sudden prickling awareness that raised the hair on the back of his neck. Years of hunting had honed his instincts, and something felt off. Tom casually reached for his rifle, pretending to check the action while scanning the tree line around him. The forest had grown quiet, he realized. The usual evening chorus of birds had fallen silent. "Hello," he called out, his voice steady. "Someone there?" Only the whisper of wind through the trees answered him. After a long moment, a distant owl hooted, and gradually the natural sounds of the forest resumed. Tom exhaled slowly, his shoulders relaxing slightly. Perhaps it was just the natural wariness that came with being alone in the wilderness. Still, he found himself building his campfire larger than usual that night, the flames casting dancing shadows that seemed to move with a life of their own among the surrounding trees. He checked his rifle one more time before settling into his sleeping bag, the weapon positioned within easy reach. As Tom drifted towards sleep, listening to the gentle crackling of the fire, he couldn't have known that these would be his last peaceful moments. Nor could he have imagined that somewhere in the darkness beyond the firelight's reach, someone was indeed watching. Someone who had followed him into this remote wilderness with intentions far removed from hunting deer. 50 miles away in Franklin, Sarah Richards moved through her evening routine with the slight adjustments that always came when Tom was away hunting. After 23 years of marriage, his absences created a familiar rhythm, a temporary solitude that she'd learned to fill with small indulgences. Tonight it was a glass of red wine and a mystery novel she'd been saving for just this occasion. As she settled into their living room armchair, Sarah glanced at the family photos arrayed on the mantel. Tom with their son Michael at his high school graduation, Tom and Sarah on their 20th anniversary trip to Charleston, the whole family at their daughter Jennifer's wedding last year. The children were grown and gone, Michael working as an engineer in Atlanta, Jennifer teaching elementary school in Raleigh. It was just the two of them in the house these days. Sarah sipped her wine, wondering idly what Tom was doing at that moment. Probably already asleep, she thought, knowing his habit of turning in early to rise before dawn for the morning hunt. A light rain had begun to patter against the windows. Nothing severe, but she hoped Tom had secured his tent properly. What Sarah couldn't have known was that this ordinary evening marked the beginning of a nightmare that would consume her life for the next 5 years. She couldn't have imagined that the comfortable patterns of her existence were about to be shattered, or that the man smiling from those photographs on the mantel was, at that very moment, in mortal danger. The first raindrops fell on Tom's tent shortly after midnight, a gentle patter that soon became a steady drumming. He woke briefly, listened to confirm it wasn't heavy enough to cause concern, then drifted back to sleep with the rain as a soothing backdrop. It was the snapping twig that jolted him fully awake. Tom's eyes flew open, his hunter's instincts immediately alert. That wasn't the sound of falling rain or wind through the trees. That was the unmistakable sound of weight pressing down on dry wood. A footstep. He lay perfectly still, controlling his breathing as he listened intently. The rain continued its steady rhythm, but beneath it, he could now discern another pattern. The careful, deliberate movement of someone trying to approach quietly. Tom reached silently for his rifle, his hand closing around the familiar wooden stock. Whoever was out there was no random hiker. No one casually wandered this deep into the woods in the middle of a rainy October night. "Who's there?" Tom called out firmly, sitting up in his sleeping bag. "I'm armed." The movements outside stopped. For several long seconds, there was only the sound of the rain. Then a voice, familiar yet unexpected, responded from the darkness. "Tom, that you? Thank God I found you." Tom frowned, his grip on the rifle not relaxing. He recognized that voice. Davis, what the hell are you doing out here in the middle of the night? Had some trouble with my truck, Chris Davis replied, his voice coming closer to the tent. Broke down about 2 miles back. Saw your campfire earlier before it went out. Been looking for help for hours. Tom hesitated, suspicion warring with basic human decency. Despite their ongoing property dispute, he couldn't leave a man stranded in the woods during a rainy night. Hold on, Tom said, reaching for his flashlight. I'm coming out. Pulling on his boots and rain jacket, Tom unzipped the tent with one hand, keeping the rifle ready in the other. The beam of his flashlight cut through the darkness and rain, illuminating Chris Davis standing 10 feet away. Davis was soaked, his dark hair plastered to his forehead, his clothes clinging to his lean frame. Jesus, you're drenched, Tom observed, lowering the rifle slightly, but not completely. How long have you been out in this? Couple hours at least, Davis replied, shivering convincingly. Truck just died on me. No cell reception out here, as you know. Tom nodded slowly. There's not much I can do tonight in this rain. You can shelter in my tent until morning. Then we'll hike back to my truck and drive to yours. Something flickered across Davis's face, a momentary expression that didn't quite match his predicament. Was it disappointment? Relief? It was gone too quickly for Tom to interpret. I appreciate that, Davis said, taking a step forward. But actually, I think I know what's wrong with my truck. If you have some tools, I might be able to fix it tonight. Got a socket wrench set in your truck? Tom's suspicion deepened. In this rain, in the dark? I've got a good flashlight, Davis persisted, and the rain's letting up. Look. Tom glanced up. It was true. The downpour had diminished to a light drizzle. Still, something felt wrong about the whole situation. How'd you know I was hunting here anyway? Tom asked, his grip tightening imperceptibly on his rifle. Davis shrugged. You mentioned your usual spot at the store today. End of Forest Service Road 7, you said. Everyone knows that's your regular hunting ground. It was a reasonable explanation, yet Tom couldn't shake his unease. He hadn't mentioned his specific campsite location to Mike at the store. Tell you what, Tom said carefully, why don't we wait until first light? It's only a few hours away. We'll both see better, and I've got coffee we can make. Davis seemed to consider this, then nodded slowly. Yeah, all right, that makes sense. He glanced at Tom's rifle, still held at a ready position. You planning to keep that pointed at me all night? Tom lowered the weapon slightly. Force of habit. Wasn't expecting visitors at this hour. Understandable, Davis replied, his tone unnaturally even. Mind if I sit by the fire pit? Try to dry out a bit. Fire's out, Tom said, but I can get it going again. As Tom bent to rekindle the fire, keeping Davis in his peripheral vision, he couldn't have known that he was making a fatal miscalculation. He couldn't have known that there was no broken-down truck, that this midnight encounter was no chance meeting, and he certainly couldn't have known that by dawn, the campsite would be empty, the fire cold, and that Tom Richards would have vanished without a trace, leaving behind only questions that would haunt his family and community for years to come. Sarah Richards woke to the sound of rain against her bedroom window. Sunday morning had arrived with a gray, misty dawn that matched her vague sense of disquiet. She'd slept poorly, troubled by dreams she couldn't quite remember, but that left her with a lingering unease. Tom was due home that evening. 3 days of hunting were coming to an end, and soon the house would again fill with his presence. Boots by the door, the smell of coffee brewing at an ungodly hour, his off-key humming while he showered. These small, ordinary rituals that she sometimes took for granted now seemed inexplicably precious. The day passed slowly. Sarah attended church, chatted with neighbors, prepared a hearty stew that would welcome Tom home. Normal Sunday activities that should have brought comfort but somehow felt mechanical. By late afternoon, she found herself checking the clock more frequently, calculating how long it would take Tom to pack up his campsite, hike back to his truck, and make the drive home from the mountains. When 6 p.m. came and went with no sign of Tom, Sarah wasn't worried. He often stayed to make the most of the final hunting day. 7 p.m. passed, then 8 p.m. The stew simmered on low heat, filling the house with aromas that usually signaled family and togetherness, but now seemed to emphasize the emptiness. By 9 o'clock p.m., the first flickers of concern began to surface. Tom was meticulous about time. If he said Sunday evening, he meant Sunday evening. Sarah tried his cell phone, knowing it was futile. There was no reception in the remote area where he hunted. Still, she tried twice more over the next hour, listening to the same voicemail greeting each time. He probably just got a late start, she told herself, though the words rang hollow in the quiet house. Or maybe he got a deer late in the day and it took time to field dress it. By 11 o'clock p.m., concern had deepened to worry. Sarah called their son Michael in Atlanta, keeping her voice steady as she explained the situation. Dad's always punctual, Michael agreed. But there could be a dozen reasons he's running late. Maybe he had car trouble or decided to wait until morning to drive back. You're right, Sarah conceded, wanting to believe it. I'm probably overreacting. Call me in the morning if he's not back, Michael said. I can drive up if needed. Sarah tried to sleep but found herself listening for the sound of Tom's truck in the driveway, the familiar creak of the front door opening. Neither came. By 6:00 a.m. Monday morning, worry had crystallized into fear. She called Jake Peterson at the garage, hoping against hope that Tom had gone straight to work. Haven't seen him, Jake confirmed, his own concern evident in his voice. He said he'd be in today, and Tom's never late without calling. That was the final confirmation Sarah needed. Tom was missing. Her next call was to the Macon County Sheriff's Department. The officer who answered took down the details with professional efficiency, but Sarah could detect the unspoken assessment in his tone. A grown man, an experienced hunter, missing for less than 24 hours. Not yet a priority. We'll send a deputy to check the parking area where his truck should be, the officer explained. If it's still there, we'll organize a proper search. Try not to worry, Mrs. Richards. We get these calls every hunting season, and most times the hunter shows up with a story about falling asleep in his truck or deciding to stay an extra day. Sarah thanked him and hung up, knowing in her heart that Tom had done neither of those things. After 23 years of marriage, she knew his habits, his sense of responsibility. Something was wrong. By 10 a.m., she received confirmation of her fears. Deputy Ryan Collins called to report that they had found Tom's blue Ford pickup truck exactly where it should have been, at the end of Forest Service Road 7. The vehicle is locked, Collins explained, and we can see the keys on the driver's seat. All of his hunting gear appears to be in the back of the truck. Sleeping bag, backpack with food, thermos, and his rifle with ammunition. Sarah felt the blood drain from her face. That doesn't make any sense, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Tom would never leave his rifle in the truck if he was going hunting. That's what concerned us as well, ma'am, Collins agreed. I've already called for additional deputies and the search and rescue team. We're treating this as a high-priority missing persons case. The next hours passed in a blur as Sarah made calls to family members. Michael immediately left Atlanta, driving north toward Franklin. Jennifer arranged for a substitute teacher to cover her class in Raleigh so she could join the family. Friends and neighbors began arriving at the Richards home, offering support and practical help. Food, coffee, someone to answer the phone while Sarah spoke with investigators. By early afternoon, Sheriff Tommy James himself arrived at Sarah's door. A tall man with graying temples and the weathered face of someone who spent considerable time outdoors, James had been sheriff for nearly a decade. He removed his hat as he entered, a gesture of respect that somehow made the situation feel even more grave. Mrs. Richards, he began, settling into the chair Sarah offered, I want you to know we've got 8 people searching the area around your husband's truck right now, and 4 more volunteers from the local search and rescue team are joining them as we speak. Sarah nodded, clutching a mug of coffee that had grown cold. Thank you, Sheriff. Have they found anything? James shook his head. Not yet, but I need to ask you some questions that might help us understand what happened. Was Tom in good spirits when he left? Any concerns or problems he mentioned? He was fine, Sarah replied automatically, then paused, remembering. Although there is that ongoing dispute with Chris Davis, the property line issue. Sheriff James's expression sharpened. Tell me more about that. Sarah explained the 3-year disagreement over the boundary between their property and Davis's adjacent land. Tom had discovered that a fence Davis erected encroached several feet onto the Richards property, according to the original survey. The matter had gone to court, but remained unresolved. How heated did this dispute get? James asked. Tom didn't talk about it much, Sarah admitted. But I know Chris has a temper. Tom mentioned once that Chris had threatened him, but he didn't take it seriously. She looked up suddenly. You don't think Chris would? Sheriff James raised a hand. We're not jumping to conclusions, Mrs. Richards. Right now, our priority is finding your husband, but we'll certainly look into any potential leads, including speaking with Mr. Davis. As the sheriff rose to leave, Sarah felt compelled to emphasize what seemed most wrong about the situation. Sheriff, you need to understand, Tom would never leave his rifle and supplies in the truck. Never. He's been hunting for over 30 years. Whatever happened, it wasn't normal. James nodded gravely. I understand. That's why we're treating this with the utmost seriousness. He hesitated, then added, Mrs. Richards, I have to ask, does your husband have any history of memory problems or disorientation? Absolutely not, Sarah said firmly. Tom is as sharp as they come. Remembers details from jobs he did 15 years ago. And no history of depression or thoughts of self-harm? Sarah's expression hardened. No, Tom loves his life. He wouldn't. I had to ask, James said apologetically. We need to rule out all possibilities. After the sheriff departed, Sarah stood by the living room window, staring out at the yard Tom had mowed just before leaving for his hunting trip. The neat rows in the grass were still visible, a mundane detail that now seemed unbearably poignant. Outside, shadows lengthened as Monday afternoon waned. In the mountains, the search continued, but the early autumn darkness would soon force the teams to suspend operations until morning. Sarah knew that each passing hour reduced the chances of finding Tom safe and well, particularly if he was injured and exposed to the elements. What she couldn't have known was that at that very moment, Deputy Ryan Collins was making a discovery that would transform the search from concerning to bewildering. As the last light faded from the sky, Collins's flashlight beam caught the glint of metal at the edge of the clearing where Tom's truck was parked. Bending down, he found a spent shell casing partially hidden among fallen leaves. It was .30-06 caliber, matching the ammunition Tom had purchased for his hunting trip. But the casing wasn't weathered or tarnished. It appeared to have been fired recently, and it wasn't found on a game trail or near a hunting blind, but in the clearing itself, mere yards from Tom's locked truck. Collins bagged the evidence carefully, his expression grim as he radioed Sheriff James. This was no longer just a missing person case. The presence of a shell casing near the truck, combined with the abandoned rifle and supplies, suggested something far more troubling. By nightfall, the search for Tom Richards had taken on a new dimension, one that would eventually involve multiple agencies, dozens of volunteers, and specialized equipment. But despite the increasing in resources and expanding search radius, the central mystery remained. How could an experienced hunter vanish without a trace from a familiar area, leaving behind everything he would need to survive in the wilderness? For Sarah Richards, waiting at home surrounded by well-meaning friends and family, the night stretched endlessly ahead, the first of many she would spend wondering where Tom was and what had happened in the remote forests of the Appalachian Mountains. Tuesday morning dawned clear and cool, perfect weather for a search operation. By 7:00 a.m., the command post established at the Forest Service Road 7 parking area buzzed with activity. Sheriff Tommy James stood over a topographic map spread across the hood of his patrol car, directing teams to specific search sectors. We got 12 deputies, 16 volunteers from search and rescue, and another 20 local folks who know these woods, he explained to Sarah, who had arrived early with Jennifer and Michael. We're using a grid pattern, starting from the truck and moving outward systematically. Sarah nodded, her eyes red-rimmed from a night without sleep. She'd insisted on being present, unable to bear waiting at home for news. Her children flanked her protectively, Michael's jaw set in determination, Jennifer's hand steady on her mother's shoulder. What about the shell casing Deputy Collins found? Michael asked. Sheriff James's expression tightened. We're treating that as potential evidence. Could be related to your father's hunting activities, could be something else. We're not jumping to conclusions. But you're considering all possibilities, Michael pressed, his tone making it more statement than question. We are, James confirmed. We've got a forensics team coming from Asheville to process the area around the truck more thoroughly. As they spoke, Two handlers arrived with German shepherds trained for search and rescue operations. David Mitchell, the lead handler, approached with his dog, a muscular animal with alert eyes and a purposeful demeanor. These dogs can pick up a human scent trail that's days old, Mitchell explained to the family. We'll start them at the truck where we know Tom was last present. Sarah watched anxiously as the handlers allowed the dogs to sniff a plaid shirt she'd brought from home, one of Tom's favorites that still carried his scent. The animals moved purposefully around the blue Ford pickup, noses to the ground, then began tracking toward a narrow trail leading into the forest. They've got something, Mitchell called out. A clear trail heading east from the parking area. For the first hour, hope surged as the dogs followed what seemed to be Tom's path into the wilderness. The handlers, deputies, and volunteers moved in a loose formation behind them, eyes scanning the forest floor for any sign of disturbance. Broken branches, footprints, personal items. Then, approximately half a mile from the parking area, something unexpected happened. Both dogs stopped abruptly at the same spot, circling a fallen oak tree that blocked the path. They sniffed frantically, whining in apparent confusion, but refused to move forward. What's happening? Sarah asked, her voice tight with anxiety. Mitchell frowned, conferring quietly with the other handler before responding. The scent trail ends here. It's as if... He hesitated, choosing his words carefully. It's as if your husband simply vanished at this point. That's impossible, Michael objected. People don't just disappear into thin air. No, they don't, Mitchell agreed. There are several possibilities. He could have been picked up by a vehicle, though there's no road access here. He could have entered water. A stream would disperse the scent, or... He trailed off. Or what? Jennifer demanded. Or someone could have taken measures to deliberately obscure the trail. Sheriff James finished, his expression grave. We're not ruling anything out at this stage. The search continued throughout the day, expanding outward from the point where the punks lost the scent. Teams checked every ravine, stream, and rocky outcropping within a 2-mile radius. A Coast Guard helicopter joined the effort by mid-afternoon, its crew using thermal imaging equipment to detect any heat signature that might indicate a human presence in the dense forest. By sunset, the search had yielded nothing. No clothing, no equipment, no signs of a struggle, no indications of where Tom Richards might have gone after reaching the fallen oak tree. It was as if he had been erased from the landscape. As the search teams regrouped at the command post, Sarah overheard Sheriff James speaking quietly to his deputies. This isn't adding up, he said, his voice low but intense. An experienced hunter doesn't leave his rifle in his truck. Dogs don't lose a scent trail without reason. And that shell casing by the parking area, I want to know if it matches Richards' ammunition. Deputy Ryan Collins nodded. Already sent it to the lab. But Sheriff, if this is foul play, where's the body? We've got 50 people combing these woods and not so much as a boot print past that fallen tree. I don't know, James admitted, but I'm bringing in Chris Davis for questioning tomorrow. If there's any connection between their property dispute and this disappearance, I want to know about it. Sarah's heart raced at these words. Until now, she'd been clinging to the hope that Tom had somehow become disoriented, perhaps suffered a fall in a remote area the searchers hadn't yet reached. The sheriff's comments forced her to confront a more disturbing possibility, that her husband's disappearance might be the result of deliberate human action. As darkness fell and the search was suspended until morning, Sarah found herself staring at the vast expanse of forest surrounding them. The Appalachian wilderness, which had always seemed like a place of beauty and renewal for Tom, now appeared menacing in its vastness and silence. Somewhere in that darkening landscape was the answer to what happened to her husband, but the forest kept its secrets well. Mom, we should go back to town for the night, Jennifer urged gently. There's nothing more we can do here until morning. Sarah nodded reluctantly. I'll be back at first light, she told Sheriff James, who promised to call immediately if there were any developments overnight. The drive back to Franklin passed in silence, each family member lost in their own thoughts and fears. Michael gripped the steering wheel tightly, his knuckles white. Jennifer stared out the window at the darkened forest rushing past. Sarah sat in the back seat, clutching Tom's spare jacket that she'd found in the hall closet that morning. Bringing it had been an impulse, a talisman of hope that they would find him cold and needing it. Back at the house, Neighbors had left casseroles and baked goods on the porch, the small town response to crisis. Inside, the answering machine blinked with messages from friends, family, and townspeople offering help and support. The ordinariness of these gestures seemed surreal against the extraordinary circumstances of Tom's disappearance. As Sarah prepared for another sleepless night, she paused in the doorway of their bedroom, looking at Tom's side of the bed, neatly made, pillow fluffed, waiting for an occupant who might never return. The terrible limbo of not knowing stretched before her like an abyss. Was he alive, injured, desperately trying to find his way back? Or had something more sinister befallen the man she'd shared her life with for 23 years? These questions would haunt not only Sarah, but an entire community in the days, weeks, months, and eventually years to come. The search for Tom Richards was just beginning, a search that would expand and contract, flare with hope and dim with despair, but never completely extinguish until the final, shocking truth was revealed. The morning fog clung to the mountains like a shroud, reducing visibility to mere yards as the search for Tom Richards entered its third day. Despite the challenging conditions, over 30 people gathered at the command post by 7 a.m., their breath visible in the crisp autumn air. The atmosphere had shifted from hopeful urgency to grim determination. Sheriff Tommy James addressed the assembled group, his voice cutting through the morning stillness. "We're expanding our search radius to 5 miles today. Teams will work in sectors, maintaining radio contact at all times. Remember, we're looking for any sign of Tom Richards, clothing, personal items, disturbances in the terrain, anything that might indicate his presence or direction of travel." Sarah Richards stood slightly apart from the crowd, her shoulders squared beneath a borrowed sheriff's department jacket that hung loosely on her frame. Dark circles shadowed her eyes, but her gaze remained clear and focused. Beside her, Michael and Jennifer conferred quietly with Ryan Collins, examining detailed topographical maps of the area. "The forensics team from Asheville has confirmed the shell casing matches the ammunition Tom purchased," Collins informed them in a low voice. "But there's something else. They found traces of blood on leaves near where the Beeks lost the scent trail. It's being tested now." Michael's jaw tightened. "You think it's Dad's?" "We don't know yet," Collins replied honestly. "It was a small amount, could be from an animal. But we're treating it as significant until proven otherwise." Jennifer placed a protective arm around her mother's shoulders. "What about Chris Davis? Has the sheriff questioned him yet?" Collins nodded. "Sheriff James spoke with him yesterday evening. Davis claims he was at home the entire weekend working on a carpentry project in his workshop. Says he has no idea where Tom might be." "And you believe him?" Michael asked sharply. "It's not about what I believe," Collins responded carefully. "It's about what we can verify. Deputies are checking with neighbors, looking for anyone who might have seen Davis during the time your father disappeared." As search teams deployed into the fog-shrouded forest, new resources arrived to aid the effort. A specialized team with climbing equipment would search the numerous ravines and canyons that scarred the mountain landscape. Volunteer cavers prepared to explore several known caverns in the area where an injured person might have sought shelter. The Coast Guard helicopter returned, equipped with improved thermal imaging technology that could potentially detect a human heat signature even beneath the forest canopy. Sarah insisted on joining one of the search teams despite concerns about her exhaustion. "I know my husband," she stated firmly. "I know what he would do in a survival situation where he might seek shelter. I need to be out there." Sheriff James reluctantly agreed, assigning her to a team led by an experienced forest ranger. As they moved through the dense undergrowth, Sarah's eyes constantly scanned the terrain, looking for any sign of disturbance. Every bent branch, every depression in the forest floor sparked momentary hope, only to fade as investigation revealed nothing conclusive. By mid-afternoon, the fog had lifted, replaced by weak autumn sunshine that did little to warm the searchers. The radio crackled with periodic check-ins from the various teams, each reporting the same disappointing result. No sign of Tom Richards. Then, shortly after 3 p.m., an excited voice broke through the static. "Command post, this is Team 4. We found something near the eastern ridge, approximately 4 miles from the parking area. Some kind of makeshift shelter." Hope surged through the search parties as coordinates were shared and teams converged on the location. Sarah and her group arrived to find several deputies examining a crude lean-to constructed from fallen branches and covered with pine boughs. Inside, there appeared to be a bed of leaves and moss. "Is it recent?" Sarah asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The lead forest ranger crouched beside the structure, examining it with practiced eyes. "Hard to say with certainty," he replied. "The cut ends on these branches aren't completely fresh, but they're not weathered either. Could be days old, could be weeks." "Could Tom have built this?" Sheriff James asked, arriving slightly breathless from his rapid hike to the site. "It's possible," the ranger conceded. "It's well constructed, someone who knows wilderness survival techniques. But there's nothing here that specifically connects it to Mr. Richards. No personal items, no equipment." The dog handlers brought their animals to investigate, but neither showed the excitement that would indicate they detected Tom's scent. After a thorough examination of the surrounding area, the shelter proved to be another dead end, likely built by a different hunter or hiker at some point before Tom's disappearance. As daylight began to fade, the search teams reluctantly returned to the command post. 3 full days of intensive searching had yielded virtually nothing beyond the blood traces and shell casing. The absence of evidence was becoming its own kind of evidence, suggesting that whatever had happened to Tom Richards was not a simple case of a hunter becoming lost or injured in familiar territory. At the command post, Sarah found Sheriff James in quiet conversation with a state police detective who had joined the investigation that morning. Their expressions were grave, and they fell silent as she approached. "What aren't you telling me?" Sarah demanded, her patience worn thin by days of uncertainty and fear. James and the detective exchanged glances before the sheriff sighed heavily. "Mrs. Richards, we've been discussing the possibility that your husband's disappearance may involve criminal activity." "You mean you think someone harmed Tom?" Sarah said flatly. It wasn't a question. "We're exploring all possibilities," the detective interjected smoothly. "The circumstances are unusual enough to warrant a broader investigation." "Chris Davis," Sarah said. "You suspect him, don't you?" "We're looking at several angles," James replied carefully. "Mr. Davis had a documented dispute with your husband, so yes, we're investigating his alibi and movements carefully, but we haven't ruled out other possibilities." "Such as," Sarah pressed, "random encounter with someone else in the forest. Drug operations. We occasionally find illegal marijuana grows in remote areas. Even the possibility that Tom encountered something unrelated to him personally but potentially dangerous." Sarah absorbed this information, her expression hardening. "The blood they found, was it Tom's?" "The preliminary test suggests it's human blood," James admitted, "but we won't have DNA confirmation for several days." "I'm sorry, Sarah. I wish I had more definitive answers for you." As the conversation concluded, Sarah walked slowly to where Michael and Jennifer waited by their car. The weight of 3 days without answers seemed to press down on her shoulders, aging her visibly. "They think someone hurt Dad," she told her children quietly. "They're treating it as a potential crime now." Michael's face darkened with barely suppressed anger. "If Davis had anything to do with this, we don't know that," Jennifer cut in, ever the voice of reason, despite her own fear. "Let the sheriff do his job. Right now, we need to focus on supporting Mom and continuing the search." As the family drove back to Franklin in the gathering darkness, none of them spoke of the growing realization that each passing day diminished the likelihood of finding Tom alive. The unspoken fear hung between them, too terrible to acknowledge but impossible to ignore. Back in town, the disappearance of Tom Richards had become the consuming topic of conversation. In diners and gas stations, on church steps and front porches, the people of Franklin speculated about what might have happened to a man many had known all their lives. Tom's colleagues from the garage had joined the volunteer search teams. Neighbors took turns bringing food to the Richards home and answering the constantly ringing phone. When Sarah arrived home that evening, she found Jake Peterson sitting on her porch steps, his weathered face lined with concern. "Any news?" he asked simply as she approached. Sarah shook her head, sinking down beside him with the bone-deep weariness of prolonged stress. "Nothing definite. They're starting to think it wasn't an accident." Jake nodded slowly. "I've been thinking the same thing. Tom knows those woods too well to just disappear, and leaving his rifle in the truck, that never made sense. Sheriff James questioned Chris Davis, Sarah said, watching Jake's reaction carefully. A muscle tightened in Jake's jaw. I'm not surprised. Those two had bad blood between them. Worse than you might know. Sarah turned to face him fully. What do you mean? What don't I know? Jake sighed heavily, rubbing a hand across his face. About 6 months ago, Tom caught Davis poaching on national forest land, not just out of season, but using illegal traps that caused animals to suffer. Tom reported him to the game warden. Davis got a hefty fine and almost lost his hunting license. He blamed Tom, said he'd regret interfering. Sarah stared at him in shock. Why didn't Tom tell me about this? He didn't want you worried, said it was just angry talk, that Davis would cool down eventually. Jake shook his head regretfully. I told Tom to take it seriously, but you know how he was always thinking the best of people. This new information cast the property dispute in a more sinister light. What Sarah had understood as a relatively minor disagreement about boundary lines now appeared to be part of a deeper, more volatile conflict, one with potential for genuine violence. I need to tell Sheriff James about this, she said, rising quickly. This changes things. I already did, Jake assured her. Called him this afternoon after I got off work. He's bringing Davis in for more questioning tomorrow. Sarah sank back down, a complex mixture of gratitude and frustration washing over her. Why didn't you mention this sooner, Jake? 3 days we've been searching, wondering what happened. I honestly didn't think it would go this far, Jake admitted, regret evident in his voice. Threats are one thing, but to actually harm someone? I never thought Davis would cross that line. He paused, then added quietly, I still hope I'm wrong. The conversation with Jake added another layer to Sarah's already overwhelming burden. As she finally entered her empty house, the silence seemed to mock the busy activity of the search operations. Here, in the home she'd shared with Tom for over 2 decades, his absence was a physical presence, a void that expanded to fill every room. In their bedroom, Sarah found herself opening Tom's closet, running her fingers along the familiar flannel shirts and work pants, hanging neatly in rows. She pressed one of his sweaters to her face, inhaling deeply, seeking the comforting scent of her husband, pine and motor oil, and the faint trace of aftershave. How long before even these sensory memories began to fade? For the first time since Tom's disappearance, Sarah allowed herself to cry openly, deep, wrenching sobs that came from a place of terrible uncertainty. Was he suffering somewhere, injured and alone? Was he already gone, his body hidden in the vastness of the forest? Or was there still reason to hope for his safe return? These questions remained unanswered as the search entered its 4th day, then its 5th. The weekend volunteers returned to their jobs, though many continued searching in their free time. The Coast Guard helicopter was recalled for an emergency elsewhere. Media interest, initially intense, began to wane without new developments. By the end of the first week, the active search operation had been reduced to a handful of dedicated deputies and family friends who refused to give up. Sarah joined them every day, pushing herself to physical exhaustion in the hope that it might temporarily quiet her mental anguish. Sheriff Tommy James maintained regular briefings with the family, though he had less and less to report. The blood found in the forest had been confirmed as human, but DNA results were still pending. Chris Davis had been questioned extensively but maintained his innocence, claiming he had been working alone in his workshop all weekend with no witnesses to confirm his alibi. Without concrete evidence linking him to Tom's disappearance, the sheriff could not justify holding him. On the 10th day, as autumn winds stripped more leaves from the trees and the first frost loomed on the horizon, Sheriff James sat down with Sarah to have the conversation he'd been dreading. We need to discuss scaling back the official search operation, he said gently. We've covered over 15 square miles of territory multiple times, used every resource available to us. At this point, he hesitated, choosing his words carefully. At this point, we need to transition from an active search to an ongoing investigation. Sarah had been expecting this moment, but the reality of it still struck like a physical blow. You're giving up on finding him. No, James said firmly. Never. This case remains open and will continue to follow every lead. But the nature of our approach needs to change. We've exhausted the search methodologies that make sense given the time frame and evidence. What he didn't say What he didn't need to say was that after 10 days in the wilderness, if Tom had been injured or exposed to the elements, chances of survival were vanishingly small. If he had met with foul play, as increasingly seemed possible, the search parameters shifted entirely. I understand, Sarah said finally, her voice steady despite the turmoil inside. But I want you to know that I won't stop looking. As long as Tom is missing, I'll be out there searching. Sheriff James nodded, respecting her determination while concerned about the toll this relentless quest would take. You have my word that this department will never close this case until we have answers. Tom deserves that. You and your family deserve that. As October gave way to November, the first snow dusted the higher elevations of the Appalachian Mountains. The forest that had been ablaze with autumn colors when Tom disappeared was now transforming into a starker, more forbidding landscape. The seasonal change seemed to mark a dividing line, before when hope still burned bright, and after when reality began its cruel intrusion. Sarah kept her promise, driving to the mountains every weekend, hiking the trails with a methodical determination that both worried and inspired those who knew her. Sometimes friends accompanied her, other times she went alone, following paths she and Tom had walked together over the years, calling his name into the vast silence. Meanwhile, the investigation continued quietly. Deputies interviewed hunters who had been in the area that weekend, checked traffic camera footage from the roads leading to and from the National Forest, and repeatedly questioned Chris Davis, looking for inconsistencies in his story. The shell casing found near Tom's truck was confirmed to match his ammunition, suggesting he had fired his rifle at least once before disappearing. A puzzling detail since the weapon had been found fully loaded in his truck. As the 1-month mark of Tom's disappearance approached, Sarah received an unexpected visitor. Carl Warren, an elderly man who lived on the outskirts of town, arrived at her door one gray November afternoon, removing his hat nervously as she invited him in. I heard about your husband, he began, declining her offer of coffee. Been following the search in the papers. And well, I found something strange about a week ago that might be nothing, but given the circumstances, I thought you should know. Sarah leaned forward, hope flaring despite her attempts to manage expectations. What did you find, Mr. Warren? I was hunting up near Bearpen Ridge, about 3 miles from where they found your husband's truck. Came across a patch of ground that didn't look right. The grass was greener, thicker than the surrounding area. In my experience, that happens when organic matter gets into the soil. Sarah's heart raced. Did you report this to the sheriff? Warren nodded. Deputy Collins came out with me yesterday. We dug down about 3 feet and found a large flat stone that had been placed there deliberately. There was a hole underneath it. A grave? Sarah whispered, her hand flying to her throat. That's what I feared, Warren admitted. But it was empty, Mrs. Richards. Well, not entirely empty. Some animal bones and old tin cans. Seems someone used it as a trash pit years ago. Deputy Collins was disappointed. Sarah exhaled slowly, the brief surge of hope, even for the grim closure of finding Tom's remains, fading as quickly as it had risen. Thank you for checking it out, Mr. Warren, and for letting me know. After the elderly man departed, Sarah stood by the window watching the November rain that had begun to fall. 1 month gone, and they were no closer to answers than on that first bewildering day. The active search had dwindled to her solitary weekend expeditions. The media had moved on to other stories. Even the concerned phone calls from distant relatives and friends had become less frequent. Tom Richards was becoming a mystery, a local legend, another name on the long list of people who had vanished in the vastness of the Appalachian wilderness over the decades. Only for Sarah and her children did he remain vibrantly real, a husband and father whose absence was an ongoing wound that refused to heal. What Sarah couldn't have known, as she watched the rain transform her yard into a tapestry of puddles, was that the answers she sought were buried deeper than any search party could reach. She couldn't have known that the truth about Tom's disappearance lay not in the remote forest where she had been searching, but much closer to home, hidden beneath layers of deception that would take years to unravel. And she certainly couldn't have known that nearly 5 years would pass before a chance discovery by 3 teenage boys would finally bring the terrible truth to light, transforming her lingering hope into the cold certainty of grief, and setting in motion a chain of events that would finally bring justice for Tom Richards. Winter descended on the mountains with an unforgiving ferocity, blanketing the search area in heavy snow that would remain until spring. The harsh conditions forced even Sarah to temporarily suspend her weekend expeditions into the wilderness. Instead, she channeled her energy into maintaining pressure on the sheriff's department, consulting with a private investigator she'd hired with savings, and creating a detailed map of all the areas that had been searched. Christmas came and went, a somber affair, despite Michael and Jennifer's attempts to maintain some semblance of normalcy for their mother. Tom's absence hung over the holiday like a shadow, his empty chair at the dinner table, the presents no one had the heart to buy for him, the traditions he had always led now painfully abandoned. "We should hang the lights anyway," Jennifer had suggested tentatively in early December. "Dad always said the house looked best with the blue and white ones along the porch rail." Sarah had nodded numbly, watching as her children struggled to untangle the familiar strands of lights, neither of them quite remembering the system Tom had perfected over years of holiday decorating. The result was messier than Tom would have achieved, but seeing the house illuminated in the darkness gave Sarah an odd comfort, as if maintaining this small tradition somehow kept a connection to her missing husband. As 2003 began, the official investigation into Tom's disappearance remained open but had lost momentum. Sheriff Tommy James met with Sarah monthly, but these meetings became increasingly brief as the lack of new leads left little to discuss. The DNA results had confirmed that the blood found in the forest was indeed human, but the small sample was too degraded for a definitive match to Tom. Chris Davis had been questioned multiple times but maintained his innocence, and without evidence directly linking him to Tom's disappearance, legal options were limited. By spring, when the snow finally melted from the highest ridges, Sarah resumed her solitary searches with renewed determination. She had spent the winter studying maps, reading accounts of other disappearances in the region, and learning wilderness survival techniques that might help her understand what could have happened to Tom. Each weekend, she systematically explored areas that the original search might have missed, focusing particularly on caves, abandoned structures, and remote hollows. News of her relentless quest spread throughout the county, inspiring both admiration and concern. Local residents often approached her in grocery stores or at church, offering information about little-known locations in the forest or reporting unusual sightings. Most of these leads proved fruitless, but Sarah followed up on each one, unable to ignore any possibility, however remote. In June 2003, a small forest fire broke out in the southern section of the search area. While the blaze was quickly contained, destroying only about 100 acres of underbrush and small trees, it created both a new worry and a grim opportunity. Sarah feared that any evidence of Tom's presence might be destroyed, but the fire also cleared dense vegetation, potentially revealing items that had been hidden from view. After the area was declared safe, Sarah joined forestry officials surveying the burn zone. They found several animal skeletons, but nothing that appeared human. The fire had reduced much of the underbrush to ash, exposing the forest floor in a way that would have made a human body or substantial remains clearly visible. Their absence reinforced what many had reluctantly begun to believe, that Tom Richards was no longer in the immediate area where he had disappeared. As the one-year anniversary approached, local media renewed their interest in the case. Sarah gave several interviews, hoping to keep Tom's story alive in public consciousness. She shared photographs of her husband, described his character and habits, and appealed directly to anyone who might have information, however insignificant it might seem. "I don't believe Tom simply vanished," she told a reporter from the Asheville newspaper. "Someone knows something. Maybe they don't realize the importance of what they saw or heard. But I'm asking them to come forward to help bring closure to our family." The anniversary itself was marked by a candlelight vigil in Franklin's town square. Nearly 200 people gathered on a cool October evening, their flames creating a pool of light in the darkness. Friends shared memories of Tom, his skill as a mechanic, his dry sense of humor, his willingness to help neighbors with car troubles at all hours. The community's support provided some comfort to Sarah and her children, a reminder that Tom had not been forgotten. But as the second year of his disappearance began, Sarah faced difficult practical matters that could no longer be postponed. Tom's continued absence had created financial and legal complications. The mortgage still needed payment, insurance policies required decisions, and Tom's position at the garage had long since been filled by necessity. After consulting with her children and an attorney, Sarah reluctantly filed for a declaration of death in absentia, a legal mechanism that would allow her to access Tom's life insurance and manage his affairs while acknowledging the overwhelming probability that he was deceased. The court filing was perhaps the most painful admission she had yet made, a formal recognition that the hope she still carried privately was statistically unfounded. The process was emotionally devastating, but provided practical relief. With the insurance settlement, Sarah was able to pay off the mortgage and establish a more sustainable financial situation. She reduced her working hours at the dental office, allowing more time for her ongoing search efforts and her work with families of other missing persons, a community she had reluctantly joined but now embraced as a source of mutual support. In 2004, a new sheriff was elected in Macon County. Dale Harrison, younger and less familiar with the case than his predecessor, initially approached the Tom Richards file with fresh energy. He assigned Detective Mark Simpson to review all evidence and re-interview key witnesses, hoping a new perspective might reveal overlooked details. Detective Simpson began by methodically reading through the entire case file, including all search reports, witness statements, and forensic analyses. He then arranged to meet with Sarah, who welcomed this renewed official interest while managing her expectations. Mrs. Richards, Simpson began during their first meeting at the Sheriff's Department, I want to be transparent with you. Cold cases like this are challenging, but not impossible to solve. I'm going to review everything from scratch, question all assumptions, and follow every thread, no matter how thin it might seem. Sarah nodded, studying the detective's earnest face. Mark Simpson was in his mid-30s, with intelligent eyes and the careful speech patterns of someone who considered his words before offering them. I appreciate your honesty, Detective. What do you need from me? For now, I'd like to hear your perspective, not just on the facts of Tom's disappearance, which are well documented, but on the context. Who might have wished him harm? Were there conflicts or tensions you might not have mentioned previously? Sometimes the smallest detail can open new avenues of investigation. This approach proved productive. As Sarah described Tom's life and relationships more comprehensively, Simpson identified several potential lines of inquiry that had received insufficient attention in the original investigation. The property dispute with Chris Davis had been thoroughly explored, but other potential conflicts, a disagreement with a customer at the garage, a minor altercation with another hunter the previous season, had been noted but not fully investigated. Most significantly, Simpson's interviews with Tom's acquaintance revealed new details about the relationship with Chris Davis. Several neighbors mentioned that the conflict had been more heated than previously reported, with one witness recalling a confrontation at the county clerk's office where Davis had allegedly threatened Tom directly. He said something like, "You'll regret this," or "You'll pay for this," the witness recalled. Tom just walked away, but Davis looked furious. His face was red, and he was clenching his fists. This information, combined with Jake Peterson's earlier revelation about the poaching incident, created a more troubling picture of Davis's potential motives. Simpson decided to focus particular attention on this aspect of the case, conducting multiple interviews with Davis and carefully examining his alibi for the weekend of Tom's disappearance. Chris Davis maintained his story that he had been working alone in his workshop all weekend on a carpentry project. No witnesses could confirm his whereabouts, but neither could anyone place him near the area where Tom disappeared. His truck, which might have contained physical evidence, had been thoroughly cleaned and used extensively in the years since the disappearance, effectively eliminating any forensic possibilities. As Simpson continued his investigation, Sarah made a difficult decision. After nearly 3 years of living alone in the house she had shared with Tom, surrounded by memories that brought both comfort and pain, she decided to move to Georgia to be closer to her daughter Jennifer, who had recently accepted a teaching position in Atlanta. "It's not giving up," she explained to Michael during a long, emotional phone call. "I'll still come back regularly to check on the investigation and continue searching. But I need a change, some distance from constantly being the woman whose husband vanished." Michael understood. He had watched his mother's identity become increasingly defined by Tom's disappearance, her life narrowing to the twin focuses of her search and preserving his memory. Perhaps some geographical separation would allow her to reclaim parts of herself that had been subsumed by grief and uncertainty. Before leaving Franklin, Sarah visited the clearing where Tom's truck had been found one last time. The blue Ford pickup had long since been released from the impound lot and sold at auction after the insurance claim was processed. The forest had reclaimed the small open space, tall grass and young saplings erasing any trace of the command post that had once bustled with activity. Standing there in the dappled sunlight of a summer afternoon, Sarah found herself speaking aloud to her absent husband. "I don't know if you can hear me, Tom. I don't know where you are, but I want you to know that I'm not abandoning you. I'm just changing strategies. I need to find a way to keep living while I keep looking for answers." A breeze stirred the leaves overhead, the forest's only response to her words. Sarah lingered until the shadows lengthened, then turned and walked back to her car, leaving behind the physical location of Tom's last known presence, but carrying with her the unresolved questions and stubborn hope that had defined the past 3 years. What Sarah couldn't have known as she drove away from the mountains was that the forest would soon yield a clue. Not a definitive answer, but a piece of the puzzle that would reignite the investigation and set it on a path toward its eventual resolution. The wilderness that had swallowed Tom Richards without a trace was preparing at last to offer a partial confession. Spring arrived in the Appalachian Mountains in 2006 with an explosion of new growth. Dogwoods unfurling delicate white blossoms, wildflowers carpeting forest floors, and birdsong filling the dawn air. Nature's renewal stood in stark contrast to the stagnation of the Tom Richards case, which had fallen into the limbo of unsolved mysteries that haunted the sheriff's department files. For Sarah Richards, now living in a small apartment near her daughter in Georgia, the changing seasons marked another painful milestone, 3.5 years since Tom's disappearance. Though she had established a quiet life teaching part-time at a local elementary school, she maintained her connection to Franklin and the investigation. Once a month, she made the 3-hour drive north to meet with Detective Mark Simpson, check for any developments, and spend a day searching in the mountains. These visits had become a ritual, more symbolic than practical as the years passed. The probability of finding new evidence diminished with each season of rain, snow, and forest growth. Yet Sarah could not bring herself to abandon the search entirely. Tom's disappearance remained an open wound that refused to heal, a mystery without resolution, grief without closure. On a rain-soaked Tuesday morning in late April 2006, Sarah was grading papers in her apartment when her phone rang. The display showed the Macon County Sheriff's Department number, causing her heart to skip. Detective Simpson rarely called between her scheduled visits unless something significant had occurred. "Mrs. Richards," Simpson's voice came through with uncharacteristic urgency. "There's been a development. A human skull has been discovered in the forest." Sarah gripped the phone tightly, her body tensing as if bracing for a physical blow. "Where?" "A forestry crew clearing fallen trees from a stream bed found it about 2 miles from where Tom's truck was parked. I need to be clear, we haven't identified the remains yet, but given the location and preliminary examination, we need to consider the possibility." "That it's Tom," Sarah finished for him, her voice oddly steady. After years of uncertainty, the prospect of concrete information, however devastating, carried its own kind of relief. "Yes, the medical examiner estimates the skull has been exposed to the elements for 3 to 5 years, which aligns with the time frame of Tom's disappearance." "I'm coming up there," Sarah said immediately. "I'll leave within the hour." "I thought you might. We'll need dental records for comparison. Do you still have access to Tom's medical files?" "Yes, I have copies of everything in a safe deposit box in Atlanta. I'll bring them with me." As Sarah packed a bag with mechanical efficiency, her mind raced with conflicting emotions. Part of her had never abandoned the faint hope that Tom might still be alive somewhere, perhaps suffering from amnesia, or having chosen to disappear for reasons she couldn't fathom. The discovery of human remains threatened to extinguish that fragile hope permanently. Yet another part of her recognized the potential for answers after years of questions. If the skull belonged to Tom, it would confirm what logic had long suggested, but her heart had resisted accepting, and it might provide crucial evidence about how he died, whether from accident, exposure, or foul play. The drive to Franklin passed in a blur of rain-slicked highways and tumultuous thoughts. Sarah arrived at the sheriff's department by late afternoon, where Detective Simpson was waiting with a gentle gravity that matched the situation. The skull has been transported to the state medical examiner's office in Chapel Hill, he explained as he led her to a private conference room. They have specialists in forensic anthropology who can perform a more detailed examination. What can you tell me about where it was found? Sarah asked, removing a folder of dental records from her bag. Simpson unfolded a map on the table, pointing to a location marked with a red X. Here, in a steep ravine that feeds into Bearpen Creek. The forestry workers were clearing debris that had created a small dam after the winter storms. The skull was partially embedded in the stream bank, exposed by erosion. Could it have been carried there by water from somewhere else? Sarah's analytical mind immediately sought to connect this discovery to what they knew about Tom's last known location. Possible, but unlikely to have moved far. The stream isn't powerful enough to transport human remains over long distances. We believe the body was originally in this general area. Sarah nodded, absorbing this information with remarkable composure. Years of living with uncertainty had forged in her a resilience that sometimes surprised even herself. What happens now? We've mobilized a search team to thoroughly examine the area where the skull was found. They'll be looking for additional remains and any personal effects, clothing, jewelry, items Tom might have been carrying. The medical examiner will compare the dental records you've brought with the skull and may attempt DNA analysis, though that's sometimes difficult with older remains. How long until we know? Dental comparison could be relatively quick, a matter of days. DNA would take longer, possibly weeks. Sarah handed over the folder containing Tom's dental records, her fingers lingering momentarily on the manila surface. These x-rays and charts, routine medical documentation from a time when life had been normal, now held the potential to confirm her worst fears. I'd like to go to the site, she said firmly. Simpson hesitated. It's an active search area and the terrain is challenging. A steep ravine with unstable ground after the recent rains. I've been hiking these mountains for 4 years looking for my husband, Sarah replied, a quiet determination in her voice. I need to see where they found him. Recognizing both the emotional necessity and Sarah's familiarity with the wilderness, Simpson agreed to take her to the site the following morning, if weather permitted. Dawn brought clearing skies, and by 7 o'clock a.m., Sarah found herself following Simpson and 2 deputies along a narrow trail that wound through dense forest toward Bearpen Creek. The path grew increasingly challenging as they descended into the ravine, requiring careful footing on slippery rocks and around exposed tree roots. At the bottom, a team of forensic technicians worked methodically in a cordoned area, sifting through soil and scanning the ground with the metal detectors. The creek gurgled nearby, its innocent babbling at odds with the grim purpose of their search. This is where the skull was found, Simpson indicated, pointing to a marked section of the stream bank. The water exposed it after years of erosion. Sarah stood silently, taking in the scene. There was nothing recognizably tragic about the location, just another beautiful corner of the Appalachian wilderness, sunlight filtering through the spring canopy, wildflowers dotting the forest floor. How many times had she passed near this spot during her searches, unaware that answers might have been just yards away? Have they found anything else? She finally asked. Some bone fragments further downstream, Simpson admitted reluctantly. Nothing definitive yet in terms of identification. As Sarah surveyed the area, trying to imagine how Tom might have ended up here, one of the technicians approached Simpson, speaking in a low voice. The detective's expression changed subtly as he listened, his professional composure momentarily slipping to reveal concern. What is it? Murrah asked, instantly alert to the shift in atmosphere. Simpson hesitated, then spoke carefully. They've just found what appears to be a section of rope embedded in the soil nearby. It shows signs of having been tied around something. The implication hung in the air between them. Hunters didn't typically carry lengths of rope unless they planned to transport large game. The presence of rope near human remains suggested something more sinister. You think he was bound? Sarah said flatly. It wasn't a question. We can't jump to conclusions, Simpson cautioned. But yes, we have to consider that possibility. If the remains are identified as Tom's, and if the rope is connected to those remains, it would significantly change the nature of our investigation. The word neither of them spoke aloud, murder, suddenly seemed to fill the ravine, transforming it from a tragic accident site to something far darker. Sarah felt a cold clarity settling over her, replacing years of uncertainty with a terrible new possibility that somehow, despite its horror, made more sense than Tom simply vanishing. Over the next 2 weeks, the search around Bearpen Creek intensified. Additional bone fragments were recovered, along with scraps of badly decomposed clothing that matched the general description of what Tom had been wearing when he disappeared. A metal belt buckle, severely corroded but of similar design to one Tom owned, was found near the largest concentration of remains. The dental records proved inconclusive due to damage to the skull, necessitating DNA analysis. Sarah provided samples, a hairbrush Tom had used that she had preserved, still containing strands of his hair. The wait for results stretched into weeks as the forensic lab processed the degraded samples. During this agonizing period of waiting, Detective Simpson refocused the investigation on the possibility of foul play. With Sheriff Harrison's approval, he assembled a task force specifically dedicated to reviewing all evidence through the lens of potential homicide. Chris Davis was brought in for additional questioning, his property searched more thoroughly than before, though no concrete evidence linking him to the remains was discovered. On a warm June morning, Sarah's phone rang again. Detective Simpson's voice carried a gravity that told her everything before he spoke the words. "The DNA results are conclusive, Sarah. The remains belong to Tom." Despite having prepared herself for this news, Sarah found herself sinking into a chair, a wave of dizziness washing over her. The thin thread of hope she had subconsciously clung to snapped, plunging her into the reality she had both feared and, in some ways, anticipated. "How did he die?" she managed to ask. The medical examiner identified evidence of trauma on the skull fragments. Two distinct impacts consistent with blunt force. There were also marks on several rib fragments, suggesting multiple stab wounds to the chest area. Simpson paused, allowing her time to process this brutal information. "Sarah, I'm so sorry, but this confirms what we've suspected since finding the rope fragments. Tom was murdered." The word hung in the air, finally spoken aloud after years of implication. Murdered. Not lost, not injured and unable to find his way out, not suffering from amnesia and living another life somewhere. Deliberately killed by human hands. "Chris Davis," Sarah said, her voice hardening with certainty. "He remains our primary person of interest," Simpson confirmed, "but we still lack physical evidence directly linking him to Tom's death. We need more, Sarah. Without it, the district attorney won't file charges." In the days that followed, Sarah found herself in an altered state of grief, different from the ambiguous loss she had carried for 4 years. This grief had edges, contours, specific horrors to process. Tom had been attacked, bound, and left to die in a remote ravine. His final moments had likely been terrifying and painful. These thoughts haunted her nights, replacing the previous endless questions with specific, gruesome images. She returned to Franklin permanently, taking a leave of absence from her teaching position in Georgia. If the investigation was accelerating, she wanted to be present for every development. She rented a small apartment in town, unwilling to return to the house she and Tom had shared, but determined to remain close to the center of the investigation. Detective Simpson kept her informed of every development, though progress remained frustratingly slow. The forensic evidence, while confirming homicide, provided few actionable clues after years of exposure to the elements. The rope fragments yielded no fingerprints or DNA. The murder weapon, likely a hunting knife based on the rib markings, had not been recovered. Chris Davis continued his life in Franklin, maintaining his innocence when questioned. The lack of evidence sufficient for arrest created an excruciating situation where Sarah occasionally encountered her husband's presumed killer at the grocery store or post office, a man walking free while Tom lay in the county morgue, his remains awaiting final disposition. Summer faded into fall, marking another hunting season in the Appalachian Mountains. For Sarah, the annual ritual that had once been Tom's passion now carried only painful associations. As October 2006 arrived, bringing the 4th anniversary of Tom's disappearance and the first with confirmed knowledge of his fate, Sarah faced decisions about laying him to rest. The county eventually released Tom's remains, now positively identified and no longer needed for the investigation. Sarah arranged a simple funeral, finally providing the memorial that had been impossible during the years of uncertainty. Friends and family gathered to honor Tom's memory and support Sarah as she took this painful step toward closure. Yet true closure remained elusive without justice. As Sarah placed flowers on Tom's grave, she made a silent promise that she would not rest until his killer was held accountable. The mystery of Tom's disappearance had been partially solved, but the quest for justice had only begun. What Sarah couldn't have known, as she stood beside the fresh grave in the autumn sunlight, was that the final piece of the puzzle would come from an unexpected source, not from the dedicated professionals who had searched for years, but from three curious teenagers with no connection to the case. The wheel of justice, which had seemed frozen for so long, was about to gain momentum through pure chance. A discovery that would transform suspicion into evidence and finally reveal the full truth of what had happened to Tom Richards on that October day in 2002. Spring 2007 brought an unusually warm April to western North Carolina. Trees leafed out early, wildflowers carpeted forest floors, and local teenagers sought adventures in the outdoors after a winter largely spent indoors. Among them were three friends from Franklin High School: Jason Cooper, his younger brother Bradley, and their classmate Michael Daniels, who had developed an interest in local history. For their American History class project, they had chosen to document abandoned structures in Macon County, old homesteads, farms, and buildings that told the story of earlier generations. Their teacher, Mr. Harmon, had encouraged this hands-on approach to history, and the boys had already photographed and researched several sites. On a sun-dappled Saturday morning, the three teenagers set out to explore the old Lillian farm, abandoned in the 1950s when the family had moved away after the tobacco market declined. The property, now owned by the Forestry Department, lay about 3 miles from where Tom Richards' truck had been discovered nearly 5 years earlier, though the boys made no connection between these facts as they parked their bicycles at the overgrown entrance to the former farm. "My grandfather says this place used to have the best tobacco in 3 counties," Jason explained as they picked their way through the brambles toward what remained of the main house. At 16, Jason was the natural leader of the group, tall and thoughtful with an innate curiosity about the past. "Not much left," observed Bradley, ducking under a low-hanging branch. 2 years younger than his brother, Bradley shared Jason's interest in history, but with more focus on the technical aspects of their documentation project. The digital camera hanging around his neck represented his contribution to the team. "According to the county records, the Mlalens left in 1954, Michael added, consulting a notebook where he'd jotted research notes from their visit to the County Historical Society. "The main house burned down in the 60s, but there should still be a barn structure and some outbuildings." The boys spent the morning documenting the stone foundation of the main house and the sagging remains of what had once been a barn. They photographed artifacts, rusty farm implements, broken crockery, the remnants of a life abandoned half a century earlier. As midday approached, they paused to eat sandwiches in the shade of a massive oak tree that had once stood in the Mlalen family's front yard. "What's that over there?" Bradley asked suddenly, pointing toward a small grove about 50 yards from the main house ruins. Jason squinted against the sunlight. "Looks like some kind of stone structure." Curious, the three boys made their way through the high grass toward the grove. As they drew closer, they could see a circular stone wall, rising about 3 feet above ground level. "It's a well," Michael realized, approaching cautiously. "My grandfather has one like this on his property. They'd build them with stones to keep the sides from collapsing." The boys gathered around the old well, peering at the craftsmanship of the stacked stones, worn smooth by decades of weather, but still solidly in place. Unlike most abandoned wells, which typically stood open to the sky or had rotted wooden covers, this one was sealed with a large concrete slab that completely covered the opening. "That's weird," Jason commented, studying the concrete cover. "This doesn't match the age of the well. These stones are old, but this concrete looks relatively new." "Yeah," agreed Bradley, running his hand over the gray surface. "There's hardly any moss or weathering on it. The stones are all covered with lichen, but this concrete is clean." Something about the incongruity triggered Jason's curiosity. "I wonder what's down there." Old wells sometimes have stuff people threw in them. Bottles, tools, all kinds of historical artifacts. "We should try to look inside," Michael suggested, his enthusiasm for their project overriding caution. for the historical record. The boys searched the area and found an old iron pipe among the barn ruins. Returning to the well, they used the pipe as a lever, wedging it under one edge of the concrete slab and applying their combined strength. At first, the heavy cover refused to budge, but after several attempts, they managed to shift it a few inches, just enough to create a gap at one side. Excited by their progress, Jason pulled a flashlight from his backpack and shone it through the narrow opening. What he saw caused him to recoil instantly, nearly dropping the flashlight. "What is it?" Bradley asked, alarmed by his brother's reaction. There's something down there," Jason replied, his voice unsteady. "It looks like bones." The other boys crowded around, taking turns peering through the gap. The flashlight beam revealed what was unmistakably a human skeleton lying at the bottom of the well, approximately 20 feet below. The bones were partially covered with fallen leaves and debris, but their human origin was unmistakable. A skull, rib cage, and the distinctive shape of arm and leg bones. "We need to call the police," Michael said, already backing away from the well. "Right now." The boys abandoned their history project and raced back to their bicycles, pedaling furiously toward town. Within 20 minutes, they reached the sheriff's department, bursting through the doors with the urgency of their discovery, overwhelming any teenage reticence about approaching authorities. Deputy Ryan Collins was on duty at the front desk, initially skeptical of the breathless teenagers until the words skeleton and well penetrated his professional reserve. After taking their initial statement, he immediately contacted Detective Mark Simpson, who had been preparing to end his shift. "The Mlellan farm?" Simpson repeated, a surge of interest evident in his voice. "That's less than 4 miles from where we found Tom Richards' remains last year." Within 40 minutes, Simpson and Collins had arrived at the abandoned farm, accompanied by a forensic technician and photographer. The 3 teenagers led them to the well, standing back as the officers approached the partially moved concrete cover. "Don't try to move it any further," Simpson instructed the deputies who had begun to position themselves around the slab. "We need to document everything exactly as it is before disturbing the scene." The photographer took dozens of images of the well, the concrete cover, and the surrounding area from every angle. Only then did Simpson authorize the careful removal of the concrete slab using proper equipment. As the heavy cover was lifted away, the contents of the well became fully visible to the assembled officers and technicians. At the bottom lay a complete human skeleton, positioned as if the person had been thrown down head first. Even more telling were the visible signs that this was no accidental death. The skeletal hands were positioned behind the back, with rotted remnants of rope still binding the wrists. Similar bindings were visible around the ankle bones. "My God," Collins murmured, the implication clear to everyone present. This was not someone who had accidentally fallen into an abandoned well. This was a body that had been bound, killed, and deliberately disposed of, hidden beneath a concrete slab that had been placed specifically to conceal the crime. "I need climbing equipment and recovery teams here immediately," Simpson ordered. "Full forensic protocol, and someone contact Sheriff Harrison. He needs to be here for this." As the recovery operation began, Simpson took the 3 teenagers aside, thanking them for their discovery while taking more detailed statements about how they had found the well and what they had observed before contacting authorities. He arranged for a deputy to drive them home, knowing their parents would be concerned about their involvement in such a grim discovery. By late afternoon, a specialized recovery team had descended into the well and begun the painstaking process of documenting and retrieving the remains. Dr. Emma Walker, the county medical examiner, arrived to conduct a preliminary examination at the scene before the skeleton was transported to her facility. Male, Caucasian, approximately 40 to 50 years of age based on skeletal indicators, she reported to Simpson after her initial assessment. Height consistent with a medium-build adult male. 2 significant fractures to the skull, one in the temporal region, one in the occipital, consistent with blunt force trauma. Multiple incisions on the ribs that appear to be knife wounds. Simpson's pulse quickened. "Time since death? Based on decomposition and environmental factors, I'd estimate 3 to 5 years, but we'll need laboratory analysis to narrow it down." Dr. Walker paused, studying Simpson's expression. "You think you know who this is?" It wasn't a question, but Simpson answered anyway. The physical parameters matched Tom Richards. The manner of death, blunt force trauma and stab wounds, aligns with the evidence we found on the partial remains recovered last year, and the timeline fits perfectly. As the skeleton was carefully raised from the well and placed in a body bag for transport, technicians continued to document and collect evidence from the scene. Fragments of clothing, denim material, remnants of what might have been a jacket, and decomposed leather boots were bagged and labeled. A leather wallet, badly damaged by moisture but still recognizable, was recovered from what would have been a back pocket of the jeans. Simpson watched these proceedings with growing certainty that they had finally found Tom Richards' primary burial site. The remains discovered in the ravine the previous year had likely been moved there by animal activity or natural erosion after being initially hidden in this well. If the wallet contained any identification, they would have confirmation within hours. By nightfall, the recovery operation was complete. The well had been thoroughly searched, photographed, and sampled for additional evidence. The concrete slab, a crucial piece of evidence itself, had been carefully transported to the sheriff's department for further analysis. And the skeleton, now in Dr. Walker's custody, awaited formal identification and detailed forensic examination. Simpson drove directly to Sarah Richards' apartment, knowing she deserved to hear this development in person rather than through an official phone call. She opened the door at his knock, immediately reading the significance of his unscheduled evening visit in his expression. "You found something," she said simply, inviting him in with a gesture that conveyed both dread and the desperate need to know. "A complete skeleton in an abandoned well at the old Mlellan farm," Simpson confirmed, taking a seat at her small kitchen table. "All indications suggest it's one, though we'll need dental records and NA to confirm absolutely." Sarah absorbed this information with a composed dignity that had characterized her response to each painful revelation over the years. "The same manner of death as the remains you found last year?" Simpson nodded. "Similar wounds, same approximate time frame. But there's more, Sarah. The body was concealed, deliberately hidden under a concrete slab placed over the well. And..." He hesitated, weighing how much detail to share. "Tell me everything," she insisted. "After 5 years, I need the whole truth, not a sanitized version." The hands and feet were bound with rope. "This confirms what we suspected. Tom was murdered, and significant effort was made to hide his body." Sarah closed her eyes briefly, processing this confirmation of her worst fears. When she opened them again, her gaze was steady, focused on the practical implications. "This is enough for an arrest now, isn't it? For Chris Davis?" "We're getting closer," Simpson replied carefully. "The concealment demonstrates premeditation, which strengthens our case considerably. But we still need to link Davis specifically to this crime scene. If we can find evidence that places him at that well or connects him to that concrete slab." "Then find it," Sarah said with quiet intensity. "My husband has been lying at the bottom of a well for 5 years while his killer walked free. I've waited long enough for justice." The following morning, the forensic team began their detailed examination of the evidence recovered from the well. The most immediately significant discovery came from the wallet. Despite water damage, they were able to recover a driver's license with Tom Richards' name and photographs still visible. There was along with a credit card also bearing his name, provided preliminary confirmation of the skeleton's identity. Dr. Walker conducted a thorough examination of the remains, confirming her initial assessment of blunt force trauma to the skull and multiple stab wounds to the chest. "The sequence appears to be beating first, followed by stabbing," she explained to Simpson. "The knife wounds show consistent directionality, suggesting a right-handed attacker facing the victim." Dental records provided by Sarah were compared to the skull's teeth by Dr. John King, a forensic odontologist. "It's a match," he confirmed after careful examination. "Particularly telling is this distinctive filling in the upper left molar. It corresponds exactly to Mr. Richards' dental records from 2001. DNA analysis, though slower, eventually provided the final confirmation. The skeleton found in the well was unquestionably that of Tom Richards, who had disappeared while hunting in October 2002. With identification established beyond doubt, the investigation shifted into high gear. Sheriff Dale Harrison personally took charge, working closely with Detective Simpson to build a case that would stand up in court. They knew their prime suspect. Now they needed evidence directly linking Chris Davis to the murder. The concrete slab became a focus of intense scrutiny. Analysis revealed it to be standard construction-grade concrete, widely available throughout the region. However, its dimensions and composition were distinctive enough that if a match could be found, it would provide compelling evidence. As Simpson later explained to Sarah, if we can show that Davis had access to identical concrete slabs, or had purchased materials to make them, or had equipment to transport such a heavy object to a remote location, any of these connections would significantly strengthen our case. The investigation was about to enter its final phase, a phase that would finally bring the full truth to light and set in motion the wheels of justice that had been stalled for nearly 5 years. For Sarah Richards, the longest wait of her life was nearing its end, though the most shocking revelations were yet to come.